We'll go ahead and get started, and if I need to go grab more chairs, I can do that. But thank you all for being here today. I'm very excited about what this weekend has become. Some of you may know this story, but a little bit of background is that a couple of years ago, Dr. Sachtleben approached me and he said, "You know, Greg, I really love the intersection of faith and science. As a retired physics and astronomy professor and a longtime member of First Presbyterian Church. And I would like to have a lasting legacy of this healthy relationship between faith and science, and we need more chairs."
We can get them if you tell us where they are.
Yeah, they're in the parlor. I think they're stacked in the corner of the parlor. Thank you. Yeah, we'll add a row in front for the latecomers here.
This door right here. So here's one that's like.
All right, so while they're getting chairs, I'll continue here. Actually, I want to make sure Damon hit record as well.
Are we recording? We are recording. Excellent.
Okay. So Dr. Sachtleben said, I want to do something where we can celebrate the wonderful relationship between faith and science. And I said, well, what would that look like? And we sort of brainstormed together and came up with this idea of a weekend symposium that both involved Hastings College and First Presbyterian Church of Hastings. And initially, Dr. Sachtleben was going to set up an endowment here at the church for that, so that after he passed, we could do that. And then maybe 6 months later, he said, "You know, Greg, I think I'd actually like to see it happen." I said, "That's a great idea. Let's try that." And so this is the inaugural Faith and Science Symposium. We hope this will also become the first annual, and that there will be a second annual and the third annual, and so on. Presbyterians have historically always seen a healthy relationship between faith and science, and that's evidenced by all of you here who are attending this talk, but also evidenced by all of the folks in our congregation who have careers in a variety of industries that have to do with science and are here as Presbyterians and people of faith, and don't see a contradiction between these two things, but instead see them as complementary. So that's really what we're doing here today. So this morning we'll have a panel discussion with a panel of experts. And we brought in a guest speaker who's been here with us all weekend. He came in on Thursday, and on Friday he spent all day at Hastings College. And when I say all day, it was actually 8 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. He did an 8 a.m. class, he did a student group for lunch, he did a public lecture in the afternoon, and then met with a student club in the evening. And so that was the connection to the college, and now the connection to the church, and we're just delighted by this. So our guest speaker is Dr. Robert von Treba, and you'll learn a little bit more about him. But he has a PhD in organic chemistry from CU Boulder and worked as a research scientist for a number of years before feeling a call to ministry. And then he went to seminary and became a pastor. And so he's had careers both in the sciences and as a religious professional. And so what a great person to start our inaugural Sachtleben-Throckmorton Faith and Science Symposium. Also on our panel is Dr. Dorothy Dean, who is the religion professor at Hastings College currently, Dr. Amanda Solum, who is a biology professor at Hastings College, and Dr. Deffenbaugh, who you all know as our scholar in residence here at First Presbyterian Church of Hastings, used to be a religion professor at Hastings College and is now a dean at the community college, right? All right. So I will open us with a word of prayer, and then I've sent them some questions that we'll let them get started thinking and talking about. Let's pray. Gracious and loving God, we read in Genesis 1 that you created order out of chaos, that your spirit swept over the waters at creation, and you declared this world as good. And then we read that you created humanity in your own image and declared humanity as very good. And so, God, as your image bearers, open our hearts and our minds today. Help us to see the beauty of your created order. Help us to see your creation in science and how that connects with our faith and how that connects with us as people of faith. bless our conversation here this morning, bless our worship service and the lecture this afternoon, God, that through it, ultimately, you may be glorified, and through it, people's hearts and minds can be opened to your love for them and your love for the world. In Jesus' holy and loving name we pray. Amen. All right. Are we fetching a few more chairs, or?
There's room for a row, another row in front.
Yes, you can be front row sitters here. All right.
Yeah, right.
It is really wonderful to have so many folks here. Thank you all for coming. So we'll go ahead and get started as we continue to find chairs and make space for folks. But the first question that I wanted to throw out to the panel is about the role of wonder. For me, both science and faith evoke a sense of wonder. I look at scientific discoveries, I look at the pictures that come back from the telescopes, and I am just in awe of the science that allows us to see these things and the wonder there. And so, how do you all, panelists, think that this shared sense of awe can build a bridge between science and faith?
All right. I think it actually promotes both fields. So I think a lot of times people are interested in studying science because they want to understand how things came to be that are really amazing at how they work. And I think that's also often how people approach faith. And science will never be able to discover every single detail of how everything is. And so sometimes when you get to the end of what science can answer, then you arrive at the steps of religion.
Thank you, Brenda.
I think there are two basic approaches to the world. One is very nihilistic and the other is very hopeful. One is that the world is nothing but sheer chaos, and we just kind of impose, a false order upon it. And, that's no way to live, frankly, from my opinion. The other is that the world is ordered and that the world actually has meaning in that order. And it's that second approach that requires a bit of faith, right? Whether you're a theologian or whether you're a scientist, because we forget about just the faith statement of saying, I believe this world is ordered. I believe this world is ordered. Sometimes there's the evidence is to the contrary, right? I believe this world is ordered and I'm filled with wonder as a result of that. I want to know more about that order. So science and religion really do start from a faith perspective, though it makes it very difficult in the way that we've kind of compartmentalized both of those. It makes it very difficult for us to see that. But wonder is a place to start, I think. So.
I'm thinking that the pursuit, the tools of science have helped us to see even more wonder than is obvious just, to the human eye. Folks who lived thousands of years ago have already discovered wonder in what they saw, but I think, as you said, the telescopes, microscopes, have helped us to see that maybe the world is even made more wonderful than ancient folks did.
Well, I think some of this comes down to how you define wonder and what wonder is at, right? I can't remember who it was who said that if you were studying the light spectrum, you were unweaving the rainbow. I know Richard Dawkins had a book about this 25 years ago called Unweaving the Rainbow. That if you'll have more wonder if you can just go, wow, there's a rainbow and I don't know why, versus if you understand, light. I don't know the word, it's not refraction, but it is right. Okay, yes, yeah. But that would imply that your wonder is only based out of your ignorance, right? That since I don't know what it is, I just have to wonder at it. But perhaps there's wonder that you get from something else, right? Just sort of the sheer fact of things existing, not because we don't have an explanation for it, but because there are these things that move us emotionally and give us a sense. Just for me, it's the wonder of how is it possible that someone was able to do something so good, in the face of incredible odds or personal danger. And it's there's that wonder there, rather than like, I don't have a way to explain it physically or chemically.
Thank you. We'll start now at the very beginning, the origins of the universe. So how do you all see faith and science offering complementary perspectives on the origin and development of the universe?
Well, the one, nobody's gonna, I don't wanna waste our time in silence here. The one place that you don't wanna start is starting to read, and unfortunately, this is where we are, starting to read the Bible as a science book, right? The Bible is not a science book. It was written as a faith document that, explains more the why of God's creation instead of the how of God's creation. And so, setting that aside, understanding that this faith statement, this testimony to the love of God in creating the world is one way of looking at the world, then you can go deeper and getting to the point of where we were talking about wonder. I think it's interesting the way that science, maybe in the 20th century, really started to push aside the need for aesthetics. Oh, we don't need beauty. We don't, what we really need is concrete reality and materialism and, theories that explain the world. But now with quantum physics at one end and cosmology at the other, scientists are left with nothing but aesthetic statements in many ways about beauty. And I don't know if that really answers your question, but you've got the Big Bang Theory and all of those things that we try to think about, but it's more of a mystery now, and I personally am okay with the mystery. But I'll be quiet.
I think the Big Bang is the best explanation we have from physics, but I'm not a physicist, so that's fine. And there's so much evidence that life occurred on Earth through evolution. It's really not something I can get around. It's just that's how people came to be. We arose from a common ancestor with bacteria and archaea, those little things that make us sick that we take antibiotics for. We're related to all of them. And I think that's part of what God intended is for us to be related to all creation on Earth. We're not just related. Sometimes people are worried that we're related to monkeys. And I'm like, oh, it's much worse than bacteria. Than all of those things. And I don't think that we should feel bad about being related to all living things that were created. Like I think that's a wonderful thing. And I think part of it comes down, people in my class don't have to agree with my belief in the world, right? They can have a literal view of the Bible. It'll be a little harder for them to understand some things. But for me, it comes down to a choice of, I put the burden of proof on science. And can I understand how a God could create a world using a process that relies on random events? No, but I don't have to, because that's what faith is for. I can believe that God knows how to do that. Other people want to view the Bible as literally how it happened, and then they have to use their faith to explain why evidence is created in the earth that would be not true, right? So it's sort of a choice of, does your faith have a role in dealing with things that you can't understand by saying that things that we find in the world aren't a real representation of what happened, or that the things I don't understand are okay not to understand?
I guess I see, I've been in different tasks, science can kind of tell us the how things were created. Although it's always tentative, people this is the best evidence or explanation we've got right now, but we may learn later. and it's maybe something else explained better, but, I think the role of religious faith is to find some meaning in that. As you said, is the universe good or bad? That's kind of a more of a faith statement. And interesting, one of the things about the creation story is it says this weird tradition of Sabbath, that humans should rest a week, is kind of built into the nature of the universe in that creation story, that even God rested on one day. And I think that's an important kind of statement about the way we're supposed to live as well.
Related to that, Rabbi is it Jonathan Sachs, who's familiar with his work? A British rabbi passed away a few years ago. Wrote something about how in the creation story in Genesis, we have something like what Pastor Greg was talking about. It is good, it is good, it is very good. And that it's not trying to tell you this is how the world was created, related to all of these things, but to say goodness is built into the foundation of the world. And you can't find goodness with a telescope or a microscope. You know, this goodness is this quality that can only exist, you know, in the realm perhaps of ethics, morality, religion. So you use this text not to say, okay, literally there are 7 days, but literally built into the pillars of the earth are this divine goodness.
Beautiful. Yeah, thank you. Dr. Sachtleben, I'm going to paraphrase you here for a little bit, so you feel free to correct me. But part of the genesis of this Faith and Science Symposium was him teaching physics and astronomy classes and talking about the origins of the universe. And he would get up and explain the scientific consensus that, you know, the universe is, or the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and the Big Bang theory that led to that. And then afterwards, his students would come up to him and say, Dr. S, how do you reconcile, we know that you go to church, how do you reconcile what you just explained to us in this lecture with your Presbyterian faith? And he delighted in those conversations. And those are the conversations that, that's one of the special things about Hastings College, those professors who will sit in the classroom after class and have these deep conversations with students about those things. And so that's part of why we're here for this Faith and Science Symposium. So did I get that about right? All right, wonderful. So we've started with the origin of the universe. Let's come down now to humanity and human identity and purpose. So what insights do you think that faith and science can provide about human identity and our purpose in life? And how can these perspectives perhaps inform each other?
Can I riff on Amanda? Real quick, just this idea of everything being connected, right? Like if science can show you that you're even related to trees, you know. I have a book for my son called Everything is Connected, and it has a line like you're even related, you're even connected to blobfish. And it's a laugh line for the kids, blobfish, it's so funny. You know, but that you're connected to all of these things, which, you know, is that sort of awe-inspiring thing, but also gives you that sense of purpose, like what do you do with this connection? Which I think can have valences of faith.
I think that human identity, I mean, I guess scientifically we can look at things that make humans different from other organisms to understand what it is to be a person. But most of what it is to be a person is not your physiology, it's not your anatomy. There are differences in our brains between humans and other organisms, but I think a lot of it is sort of like how you develop as a person and your personality and your ethics and your goals, which sort of requires a lot of people working together, right? You think about how you're formed by faith, you're formed by your community, by your family. So I think that there's a lot of involvement in faith in determining your identity as a person, as well as sort of your whole community and the way that you grow up. and the things that you find important, and makes us all human, but all very different people.
You repeat the question, Greg?
What insights do faith and science provide about human identity and our purpose in life, and how can these perspectives inform each other?
This may be a bummer, all right, but one of the things that I've really benefited from, it all depends, if we're gonna talk about psychology as a hard science or as a so-called soft science, but it's a science, it uses the scientific method, especially cognitive, behaviors types of psychology. I'm kind of pessimistic about this, but this is very Calvinistic too, that human beings are depraved. That's there is a sinfulness to them. There is a selfishness about who we are, that I just think the more that we look at psychoanalysis and we look at behaviorism and everything like that, it just affirms that we have to overcome that natural selfishness that we have. The first thing that we do, and when you think about it, it's, the way that we're born, we can't help but think that we're the center of the world, right? We spend 2 years, our mothers just take care of us like we're, the God who was born on Mount Olympus or something like that. And then we spend the rest of our life unlearning that. We really do, and I think especially psychoanalysis has shown that what St. Augustine and Paul and Luther and all of those others were saying, there is an original sin. Let's not talk about going back to Adam, but there is a kind of brokenness that we all have to overcome. But there is hope in that too, because, as it says in Genesis chapter 4, sin is couching at your door, but you must overcome it. And that is something that is a challenge that makes us who we are as humans, trying to overcome ourselves and to be truly human, which I believe, we're created good, as we were talking about. But sometimes that goodness is marred, and our whole life is this process of trying to be more than what, our lowest common denominator says that we are. So I don't know if that's, that's not so much physical hard science, but psychology has really been very insightful in that respect.
Yeah, so as the science of psychology has developed, it's become pretty complementary to many of our understanding of faith that Augustine wrote about before there was any idea of what psychology was, or Ansel wrote about. Yeah, that's good point.
Let me kind of follow up on that. I think I talked about this with some of the students on Friday. One of the things I learned is that the human brain, if you take it apart and take a look at it, you discover that at its core, there is a structure very similar to a reptile brain, which was some of our ancient ancestors, right? And then, and all as far as we know, all reptiles care about is survival and reproduction. And around that is a slightly more complex brain that is common with like apes, also probably some of our evolutionary ancestors. And then around that is this remarkable structure whereby we can think symbolically and language and contemplate our own existence, so the human part. And I think it is our faith that helps us to really tap into that human part that can go beyond just survival in order to even sacrificial love, which is not something I don't think that a lot of primitive animals do. And contemplate, that there is this maybe this force being built beyond us. And I think when we're stressed, we tend to work out of that very primitive part of us.
That's fight or flight.
Yeah.
Respond. The amygdala, right? Is the amygdala what we're talking about?
I think so.
That's the reptile part of the brain, and too often we fall back on, and I might call that original sin, but we fall back on that fight or flight response.
Yeah, all we care.
He hit me, I'm gonna hit him back, or, yeah. So. So,
So this is leaning into a conversation perhaps about ethics and responsibility, right, as humanity. And so how do we think that faith can provide an ethical framework for scientific endeavors or religious beliefs guiding scientists making responsible decisions? There's a meme, a picture that somebody has made out there that I really have always appreciated. And it says, science has taught us how to clone a dinosaur, and humanities have taught us why that's not a good idea. And we need both. It's wonderful to have the scientific knowledge on how to clone a dinosaur, and it's important to have the knowledge of humanities and social sciences that says, perhaps, let's watch Jurassic Park and realize that's not a good idea. So anyways, how can faith and science work together with ethics and human responsibility?
Well, I think it is our faith first. I'll probably talk about this in my lecture, but a teacher of mine once made the comment that the opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is fear. And I think it is our faith that helps us to live in spite of and make choices in spite of our fears. Our fears for our own self-survival, those closest to us. And so it helps to think just beyond what's the immediate, benefit for me, and sees us connected maybe with the wider world, and we have responsibilities to care for others as well. So that's part of it.
Say that again. So the opposite of faith.
Yeah. There's a story in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus calms the sea, and his disciples are in a panic, and they wake him up and he calms it, and then he says, why were you afraid? Have you no faith? And this teacher of mine made the comment that he says, I think that means that the opposite of faith is not doubt. It's not, oh, I believe this, but it's the opposite of faith is fear. And so our faith helps us to overcome fear, that we're loved, that there may be even, life beyond what we can see.
And I think that also ties in to the previous question about our reptile brain, and it's our faith that gives us that ethical framework to overcome that and not just respond in fight or flight or whatever. Yeah.
I think ethics in science has a lot of different pieces. And a lot of the things, so now NIH and NSF do require a certain number of hours of ethical training for graduate students and ongoing ethical training. And it's partly because we have so many times where we have made the wrong choice. So everyone's heard of the Tuskegee syphilis studies, right? Where we experimented and let African-American men to continue to be untreated for syphilis after we had a treatment to see what would happen. Right, and that was recognized as wrong. Not as many people know that after that was declared wrong, we sent people to another country to do STD experiments, I believe in Guatemala, with US health workers. We infected orphans, people in jail, prostitutes. They were infected on purpose to give them STDs and studied and not always treated. Surely people knew that it was wrong. It had been declared wrong in the United States, but a large people with significant ethical responsibility decided it was okay to do somewhere else, right? And that is not something that science said was okay or religion said was okay, but STDs used to be a really big health issue. They were so desperate to find those solutions and understand it that they made choices that we see as wrong. That's one of the reasons you can't just do stuff in a nation with less resources. you can't experiment on people in prisons without additional protection, orphans without additional protection. We've had put more and more regulations over time. And I would say there's also, we historically like to take advantage of people who are not white and wealthy people, right? We've also had sterilizations where we told people they were getting appendectomies because we thought that we knew that it would be better to make sure they couldn't have more children, right? They weren't told. So I think there has been a lot more, and I think a lot of different things contribute to that ethical framework, including religion and looking at the past. But we're at the point now where there are a bunch of things that are known. There are a lot more laws to try to prevent things from happening that are unethical. But you never know what you're going to find out was actually unethical 10 years later. So our job is to think about what are the things that are happening now that we might not anticipate the impact. So there's the Havasupai people, an indigenous people in the United States, and they had some genetics results done to look at a health condition in the tribe. And they signed consent forms. They were very careful. They did the consenting, they did all of these things. So that seems like that should be good, right? We did all the consenting forms. Their information was stored and they consented to have that. And people used that for additional genetic experiments that showed where those people had originated from geographically in the distant past. And that is not what their origin story says in their religion, right? So we have then, they would not have consented to have information taken that said that their religion was wrong, right? So then we're like, oh, well, they didn't sign a separate consent for that. No one thought about whether that would be an issue or that they would have to reconsent for that kind of thing. So we're at a time where we have a lot of information. So it's about anticipating. We think we covered our bases. What could there be that we look back 5 years later that we realize we've done that's wrong? And I think the more people that think about anticipating those things and thinking about what they could be, the better. And I think certainly a faith perspective that you need to care for other people and take care of the downtrodden. It's good to keep in the ethics room.
I have to go
Yes.
too far, but I just want to say one thing and then I'll leave it to the others. But I think it's important I completely agree with everything Dr. Solum said, but I think it's also important to remember that faith is not the only thing that will keep people from doing the bad things, right? That some people have immense faith that I'm doing this for the good of mankind, or I'm doing God's will, and that's why I must experiment on these orphans, right? So I think it's important to have both, secular reason and religious faith and science all in this conversation together to be like, let's really think about what we're doing, and to have the science to inform us that sometimes people get so wrapped up in something that they consider to be faith that then they go and do things as a group and it just feels so right and just believe that it's right, and then horrible things happen. Not to be a big bummer is the last thing that I say, but just to be clear-eyed about that. That I think that's why it's so important that these things need to talk to each other and not just each other. Thank you. I'll be singing in the choir.
What Dorothy is referring to is actually, there's a little quip that someone named Saint Anselm in the 11th century came up with, is that we should have faith, but we should always be seeking understanding. And he was saying this at a time when Aristotle was being reintroduced in Aristotelian logic, and they were using that in theology. But even today, the seeking understanding comes as a result of the scientific method. And we all use the scientific method. We do one thing and it doesn't work out. We do it again, it doesn't work out. The third time, what do we think? We better not do that again because it won't work out. That's basic scientific method. And so we don't want to just set aside our reason because it has given us so many wonderful benefits to living in this world as human beings. So that's something that's always been at the core of Presbyterianism. You know, Calvin, especially was influenced by the humanist movement, and use of reason, and, you know, systematic thinking. And it was an early science, you might say. And it would eventually go on to influence others like Newton, who would use systematic thinking to come up with, you know, some of the laws that we know of physics. So we can't separate those two out. We are scientists, whether we believe it or not, and we use science to help us understand who we are. And that's informed by our faith as well. So.
Ready for the next question? We'll ask a couple more questions and then we'll open it up to you all, if any of you have any questions, but, so I grew up in a church where there was not an inherent conflict between faith and science. I grew up in a church that was close to Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, and we had a bunch of professors in our congregation, including science professors and religion professors. And these were the people who taught my classes and were my confirmation sponsors. But there are some Christian traditions in the United States that do see an inherent conflict between faith and science. And so, what are some effective ways for religious and scientific communities to dialogue and perhaps collaborate? And how can we encourage constructive dialogue between these communities?
I would like to respond to this. I think about this a lot. And I want you all to think about this because it's almost counterintuitive. But there's a difference between fact and truth. And with the scientific revolution, we have come to somehow think that everything that's factual is truthful. And if it's not factual, it's not truthful. Read the Bible and then say, well, these are not facts. We can't, you know, confirm that these things ever happened, right? Therefore, it must not be truthful. And there are some scientists who say that. That's strict scientific, you know, method right there. You can't confirm that Adam and Eve ever existed, therefore it's not true. There's a difference between fact and truth. And this goes to what Amanda was just saying. And I think the group you're talking about was the Lakota. And they, you know, gave their genetics for research. The Lakota believed that, you know, they emerged from the ground up in the Black Hills, and thus this whole Great Plains area was theirs. They're completely tied to the land. Science tells them, no, you actually kind of emerged from, you know, on the other side of the east of the Mississippi River, and then settled in this land probably around the 16th century. That's the fact. The Lakota still believe that the truth is that they emerged from the Black Hills. The two do not necessarily have to be in conflict with each other. For our tradition, Adam and Eve most likely never existed as we read about them in Genesis. There probably wasn't an Adam, there probably wasn't an Eve, they didn't have navels, that kind of thing. No, those people never existed. So that's not factual. The story's not factual, and science can pretty much determine that, right? But the story tells us something that's very true about human beings, that if given the chance, we'll mess up. If given boundaries, and this works to the good as well as the bad, if given boundaries, we will always try to reach beyond those boundaries. A man's reach must exceed his grasp, or else what is a heaven for, as Browning said, right? That's the truth of the Adam and Eve story, regardless of its facticity. And that's where we need to really, you know, make some distinctions between what science does and what religion does. I can affirm that that story probably never happened. Cain and Abel probably never happened. A lot of, you know, some biblical scholars are even talking about some of the things in Jesus' life as never having happened factually. It doesn't make it less true. Not necessarily. So, anyway, that's been a big conflict for me my whole life, because I'm a science and religion guy. And that's the place where I've come down. It's like, no, truth and fact are not synonymous. So. anyway.
I think one of the challenges for people who do take the Bible literally as a document, that every word must be true, is if they often feel that if you say that any word is not true, that you're saying their entire faith is wrong.
Yeah.
So I try to make sure that if I have that kind of conversation, that I make sure that I say something like, I'm not saying that you can't believe what you believe in, or that what you believe in is wrong. And like, even if one part doesn't agree, that doesn't mean that I think that your religion is wrong. There are some things I try to think about in a conversation, so I try very hard not to say that I believe in evolution, because it's not a faith system.
Right.
It's just something that happens. So I believe in a religion. I understand that life occurred through evolution, right? I try to discuss how you can't prove or disprove that God exists, because you can never do a control experiment without a God and a real experiment with God, right? So that's not something that you can explore. I also try to explain the difference between a theory and science. And people say, oh, that's just a theory, right? It's just something you're thinking of. Whereas in science, to become a theory, I can tell you, you have like 5 million facts and 5 million experiments that can all be explained by the same thing. So a theory is much stronger than a fact, right? And so you might have a theory that's supported by 5,000 facts and not by 300, and the theory would stand. Just like in the Bible, you might have some things that didn't historically occur, but we still respect the document as a faith document. And I think if a conversation is just going to be distracting to the other person, and it's not going to change the way they think about things, I think that's time to end the conversation. If you can get it so they could just start to see a different perspective, then that's a good place to be.
I think one of the challenges or starting points for developing a theology or a faith is people wanna find, what is something I can really depend on that I know will be true? And that has probably been different things over the course of at least Christian history. At the time of the Reformation, basically Martin Luther and later Calvin said, we've often been just depending on church tradition. And they found that, well, that gets you into trouble. And they kind of said, we're gonna go with just the Bible. That's the one thing. And I think that has came out of that attempt. What is something that we can hold on to that won't change? And that's where I think this desire for a biblical literalism, fundamentalism comes from, is, what can I depend on that won't change? I think you kind of have to build faith on more than that. I always say, John Wesley, who started Methodism, said, my sources for thinking through my faith are the Bible, but also human experience and human reason and church tradition. I think the Holy Spirit needs to be in there as well. That's what the early church depended on. And that idea that over the course of history, we have, the Christian faith has looked at these different sources and haven't always held the same view on those as well. So, there are other ways to do it.
Thank you. We've got 15 more minutes. Does anybody have a question or that they'd like to ask our panel here?
What's the challenge? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, well, in opinion,
Please.
I have faith that God is a God of science. God has a plan. God understands chemistry better than we understand chemistry. God understands physics. God is created a experiment of the teeny tiny parts of it. And we'll never know what it is, but there's inherent rightness and wrongness. The Lord knows that. Science is part of God's plan. God understands the genome. God understands more than what we know about science. That's my opinion.
Thank you, Andy. That's very close to, I think, the understanding I grew up with in the church that I grew up in is God created science. So why would these things be in conflict? If God created science and God created humanity with the wisdom to do scientific discovery, why would these things need to be in conflict? So that certainly is sort of what I grew up with in my church.
Remember also that humans built the Tower of Babel. And we try with our science to build the Tower of Babel. And oftentimes we end up exceeding the bounds which make us human. We try to become gods ourselves, right? And that's the place where we have to be so careful, right? Because, you know, we've got the technology not only to build the Tower of Babel now, but to utterly destroy it 5 or 6 times over. And that's the scary part, you know? And so that's the place where I think faith can do a lot to try to temper the fight or flight response of the lizard brain that we're seeing all around the world, right?
Yeah.
So, sorry.
No. Other questions? Brady, did you have something?
Well, the climate crisis is such an incredible scientific thing that we're working hard to prove, yet there's this human side of things that just is so difficult to believe in it. You know, you can, I don't know what my question is here, except it's like the perfect storm for things that it's hard for people to understand and believe. And yet there's this incredible human cost. Just, put some juxtaposition on there in
Yeah.
some way.
So I had a question that I had sent to them ahead of time, so I'll read them that question, which I think gets this, so they at least, how can religious beliefs and scientific understanding work together to address environmental challenges like climate change? And then the part of your question is, there's a group of folks out there that don't understand science or don't trust or believe in the science, and some of those same folks say it's their faith that leads them to not trust or believe in the climate science, right? And so how do we wrestle with that?
So I think part of the issue is fundamentally our science education is not sufficient, right? So one of the things that makes climate change hard is that you can't put a single event and say it caused this, right? Because we're just seeing an overall increase in events, but we can't say if that tornado would have happened or would not have happened with climate change, right? It's just more likely to occur. Things like that are much harder to understand. I think people don't understand modeling well. So when we have a complex system, some people who are really good at that write lots of equations, right? And they make an algorithm to predict what will happen. And you don't get one answer each time, right? You get like a range of answers and you try to understand what will happen. And you know that your model is not perfect and it might be wrong. But it has value, right? So getting people to understand, yes, the model might not be exactly accurate and it might not be exactly what will happen, but it's the best information we have and it is likely to be at least partly correct, right? Those things are very hard for people to understand. And I think people also don't want to believe that they have the power to change the earth, even though they do. And so I think if people don't feel like those are things that they can accept, if they do have an idea from Genesis that it's their idea to care for the earth. I'm hoping we could tap into that faith perspective instead, to be like, well, even if you don't think climate change is happening and you don't believe any of those things, if you're going to be a caretaker for the earth, how about we do these things just to be good caretakers?
And it really boils down to where our faith is the most passionate. Let me ask everyone here, what do you read more, your portfolio, your investments, or the Bible? How often do you go and look at the Dow and see, oh, it's up today, you know, versus, oh, I've just read John 1, chapters 1 through 14, and I've reflected. Our faith in the United States is in capitalism. Sorry, pure and simple, it's in capitalism. We must continually have an economic system that is increasing at 4%, and if it's not, oh my God, the world is gonna fall apart, right? But then over on the other side, you know, we have this faith that says, you know, there's a lot about this Tower of Babel over here that's really destroying the planet. And our faith is saying that we need, as Amanda's saying, we need to be caretakers of the planet. So Brady, what happens is people just don't want to read the facts, you know? They have alternative facts. They have alternative facts that fit their worldview, which is founded on a faith that is greater than their spiritual faith. I get upset with people who, you know, that they're great environmentalists, but they have no problem stepping on an airplane 10 or 12 times a year to fly around the world. Well, that contributes to global warming, perhaps more than anything, right? So, you know, how serious are you about your faith? Which faith are you the most serious about? The Dow Jones Industrial Average or the one that you find in the Bible right here? And it's, that's where I think the problem lies, Brady. It's not that they can't understand it. I think we can all understand it. You know, we've been in a hot house before. We've been in a greenhouse. It's just, we don't want to understand it. And there are people out there that will help us not to understand it because it will keep the engines of commerce moving ever forward at 4% growth, you know, without inflation and all those things that are apocalyptic in our secular world. So, sound like Jeremiah here, I know, but that's how I answer that question, because it upsets me and it upsets our children. Really upsets our children too. And they're gonna be the ones to solve it, not us. Because we baby boomers are used to the stuff. We like the stuff. And so there's great hope in the, you know, in the Esthers and, you know, the other children that we have in our congregation, I think. Enough for me.
A great segue into next week is Confirmation Sunday. So you're gonna hear 11 eighth graders stand up and share their statements of faith that do, I think, give us a great deal of hope for the future. So I'll just put that plug in now. Please be back next week in worship. That'll be the 10:30 service. So, Bob, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, I mean, yeah, there are people who their own religious faith has taken them to say, either, you know, the earth is here for our use, we can't really affect it. Or to say, you know, ultimately the point of my faith is not to worry about this earth, but to get onto something better after I die. And so what happens here doesn't really matter. But I think what Dan was saying, you know, sometimes we construct our faith ideas based on what benefits me. And those closest to me, my family, my community, without maybe regard for the larger picture of humanity. And yeah, even I'm good at saying, here's what I believe, except when it's inconvenient.
And that's the sin that's couching at the door that we must overcome throughout our whole lives with the help of the Holy Spirit, right? So.
Got time for one more question, Catherine?
So I have a question about how you see this conflict coming in. To me, it kind of comes down to the role of like a lack of humility. I've noticed that kind of like an angry extreme atheist or like somebody who's like science overall, right? And also like a theobro, right? Same kind of fallacy of that nothing, like there's just no room for doubt or no room for mystery. I'm curious why you think that this same sort of fallacy or tendency is developed in both of these groups. And how do we, I don't know, I'm not terribly optimistic about diffusing it just because we are in a moment where everyone needs to have a hot take and the hot take needs to fit in like a little concise like Instagram post. And if you don't have that, then you know you're not saying anything important, which is stupid, right? It leaves no room for nuance. And so anyway, I see we're moving away from this, but why do you think that this has maybe happened?
Everyone needs a hot, what,
Hot take.
a hot take.
Hot take. There you go. Dan, you can
A
incorporate
soundbite.
that.
Like that.
I need to translate into boomer for him.
Uh,
I love you, Dan.
Our Gen X bridge here.
Millennial Gen X.
We'll get there.
We all want easy answers, don't we? I mean, it's easy to have a very limited worldview that has very pat answers to things, ideology that isn't open to questions. And that's betraying your humanity, you know, because your humanity is asked to be faithful, yet continually seeking understanding, you know. Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I think humility is great in both fields. You know, we like to think we've got the right answer and got things figured out, but, you know, ideally, science should be open to new information coming in and changing your theory in order to say, okay, we thought we had this figured out, maybe we don't. That doesn't always happen, unfortunately, or it can be a struggle, but you know, in faith, I think we also want to, you know, we want to know exactly what's right and have that figured out. And it's important, I think, to be open to having that question and changing our mind. I've seen this kind of, I don't know if it was original with Charles Schultz, but you know, Peanuts comic strip where Snoopy writes a book on theology and he says, I've got the best title, which is, have you ever considered you might be wrong? But yeah, I think it's important and a lot of Christian theologians are open to being, you know, rethinking things. I think that's important. So humility is a great human. Yes.
Yeah, and I'll let you end us, Amanda, but in addition to faith seeking understanding, there's another catchphrase we use in the Presbyterian Church, which is that we are reformed and always reforming. That it is an ongoing thing, that God is still speaking to us. And an example that I use of that is recognizing women's leadership in church. So until the 1950s, the Presbyterian Church did not let women become elders or pastors. And we had thoughtful, faithful theologians and seminary professors studying those scriptures in the 1940s and 50s, and they said, we might have had this one wrong. And we go back and we look at the scriptures that we've used to keep women out of leadership for centuries or millennia, and we perhaps did not actually interpret those correctly. And so then in the 1950s, the Presbyterian Church had a decade-long dialogue about that, and the outcome of that was the humility to say we had it wrong, and that women, in fact, do have a role in leadership in the church as elders of churches and as pastors. And so God was still speaking to us, and we were humble enough at that moment to acknowledge that God was still speaking to us and to say what used to be an essential tenet of our faith has actually changed based upon our study and prayer and our coming together as a community and our dialogue. And so I think that's a good thing when it can happen. Yeah.
I think my sense as someone who has no expertise in this area, because I think in psychology, is that when people have a very narrow view of the world that cannot be altered, you have to defend that ever more strongly, because if the littlest bit breaks, it all falls apart and you've lost all of your kind of anchor to the world and who you are. So I think, I don't know how you bring those people to a place where they feel safe enough that like a little piece could not be right and they would be okay. And so I don't know if we need to like kind of form community and connections. So if they ever got to the point where they questioned something, there would be somewhere for them to fall.
Beautiful. Well, it's 10:15, so we need to wrap up so that, Bob and I can get ready to go to lead worship. But again, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Dr. Sachtleben, for coming up with this idea, and join us in worship at 10:30, and Bob will be preaching, and then come back at 3 o'clock for a public lecture about faith and science. We did one of these at Hastings College and got some community members that came, and I think we'll have the same thing happen probably this afternoon as well. So we hope you can join us for that. So thank you.